Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Reality Vibes, where facts speak louder than feelings, and we don't apologize for common sense. For my final multimedia project assignment as part of the course EMH 2020 American History since 1877, today we are taking a closer look at one of the most dangerous moments in modern American history, a confrontation that reshaped US foreign policy and defined the Cold War era. I'm talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the showdown between the United States, the Soviet Union, and the communist dictatorship in Cuba that brought the war within inches of nuclear war. But this isn't just history in the abstract. The consequences of the crisis didn't end in 1962. For Cuba, the Soviet withdrawal agreement and the US non-invasion pledge became the final nail in the coffin for any realistic possibility of political change on the island, solidifying the island's authoritarian trajectory and creating a geopolitical reality that shaped US foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere for decades to come. So let's break this down. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was the peak of Cold War tension and one of the closest moments the war ever came to nuclear conflict. To understand how the United States and the Soviet Union ended up in this dangerous standoff, we have to look at what happened in Cuba in the years leading up to it. According to the American Yawp, Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution initiated a new era of Cuban history and quickly changed the island's political direction. Relations with the United States collapsed as Cuba implemented land reforms, nationalized private property, and aligned itself with the Soviet Union. By 1960, the United States had imposed a near-total trade embargo, and in January 1961, it cut diplomatic ties completely. The situation worsened after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. As the American Yawp explains, these operations ended in a tremendous embarrassment for the Kennedy administration, pushing Cuba to rely even more heavily on Soviet protection. In this new environment, the Soviet Union made a strategic decision to deploy nuclear weapons to the island. They transported a total of 36 of the R-12 Sapphire, NATO designation as SS-4 Sandal, medium-range ballistic missiles of MRBMs, capable of striking the United States, the eastern area, with a reach of 2,000 kilometers or 1,200 miles and a yield of 1 to 2.3 megatons, along with a total of 24 of the R-14, known as cruise-ship Arrow, NATO designation SS-5 Skin, intermediate range ballistic missiles, IRBMs, which will have extended the threat to most of the continental United States once assembled due to the range of 4,500 kilometers or 2,800 miles, and available yield of 1 to 2 megatons each. Soviet forces in Cuba also possessed other offensive nuclear weapons, such as 12 short-range nuclear-capable Luna, aka Frog rockets, with a reach of 45 kilometers or 28 miles and a yield of 12 to 14 kilotons each, and 80 ground-launched nuclear tactical cruise missiles, known as Kennel, aka FKR, with a reach of 180 kilometers or 110 miles and a yield of 2 kilotons each, both placed there to discourage the United States from using ground military forces to remove the missiles. And finally, at least 42 Ilyushin IL-28, aka Beagle, tactical nuclear bombers. However, all of this vast nuclear weaponry, the medium-range ballistic missiles, MRBMs, specifically the R-12, remain the most significant threat and therefore the primary focus of the United States. So in October 1962, American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft photographed the 6 R-12 launched sites under construction, When President John F. Kennedy reviewed the evidence, he addressed the nation on October 22nd, stating that, and I quote, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparations, and he announced a naval quarantine to block additional Soviet military shipments while the United States sought a resolution. For 13 days, the war followed the negotiations and the movement of American and Soviet forces with extraordinary tensions. Both sides faced internal pressure for stronger actions, and declassified documents showed that miscommunication was one of the greatest dangers. One striking example is the insanity of Fidel Castro's position and the language he used when communicating with Soviet leaders. In his October 26 letter to Khrushchev, Castro wrote that he believed a US invasion was inevitable and that if war began, the Soviet Union should not hesitate to respond with full force, even if that meant devastating consequences for Cuba. This echoed sentiment he expressed in other speeches of the period, where he remarked that he would rather see the island sink into the sea than surrender to what he called imperialist domination. These statements reveal a sharp contrast between Havana and Moscow. Castro viewed total destruction as preferable to defeat, while Khrushchev clearly saw such thinking as reckless. Now, his reply to Castro emphasized the need to avoid the destruction of the Cuban people, and he rejected the idea of accepting annihilation in the name of ideological purity. So Khrushchev's reply made clear that he considered Castro's position dangerously aggressive. He reminded Castro that a nuclear exchange will mean the destruction of both Cuba and the Soviet Union. The exchange reveals a key fact often overshadowed in textbook summaries, which is Castro was willing to face nuclear war rather than allow what he believed was an inevitable US invasion, while the Soviet leadership was more cautious, and also underscores how dangerously close the crisis came to spiraling beyond the control of even the superpowers themselves. Tensions extended far beyond political messages. Several Soviet submarines near the US naval quarantine line carried nuclear torpedoes, and the crews were unaware of the full diplomatic situation. In one case, US Navy ships dropped practice depth charges to force the submarine to surface, but those on board interpreted the explosions as the beginning of a real attack. Years later, declassified records show that it took the refusal of one Soviet officer, Vasily Arkhipov, to prevent the launch of a nuclear torpedo. This was one of the several moments where the crisis could have escalated to accident rather than intention. The internal US debate was equally intense. The film 13 Days on 2000, although dramatized, it captures the atmosphere surrounding the executive committee meetings where military leaders push for airstrikes or invasions while others argue for a diplomatic solution. The movie reflects the pressure described in the documentary evidence, intelligence briefings, conflicting recommendations, and ongoing uncertainty about Soviet intentions. Throughout the crisis, unofficial channels play a critical role. Attorney General Robert Kennedy met privately with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin to explore terms both sides could accept without losing credibility. These conversations helped coordinate what became the final agreement: the Soviet removal of missiles in Cuba, a public US promise not to invade the island, and a quiet understanding that US Jupiter missiles in Turkey will be withdrawn afterward. When the resolution was announced on October 28th, it avoided immediate conflict, but the consequences were lasting. Number one, It's that the Cuban Missile Crisis transformed how both superpowers approach intelligence, communications, and nuclear risk. The United States reassessed its surveillance and military procedures after realizing how easily gaps in information could bring the world to the edge of catastrophe, while the Soviet Union revised its own methods for deploying strategic weapons abroad. The crisis also revealed how accidental escalation was just as dangerous as intentional conflict. Submarine incidents, misread signals, and high-pressure decisions showed that misunderstanding alone could trigger nuclear war. In response, Washington and Moscow established the direct hotline between the White House and the Kremlin and expanded crisis management protocols, creating new communications, reconnaissance, and verification systems to prevent future misunderstandings and to reduce the possibility of a nuclear exchange caused by confusion rather than design. Number two, it's that another consequence is that after the crisis ended, Fidel Castro felt deeply betrayed by the Soviet Union. Moscow had negotiated the whole settlement directly with Washington without including him, and the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles, even though Castro wanted to keep them as a deterrent against future invasions. The fact that Khrushchev made the final decision without consulting the Cuban leadership created resentment in Havana. Castro believed that the Soviet Union had treated Cuba as a pawn in a global chess match rather than as an equal revolutionary partner. His anger is well documented. He refused to allow on-site UN inspections, criticized the Soviet concession, and openly complained that Cuba's security had been compromised. The Soviet side, for its part, was frustrated with what it considered Castro's impulsiveness and his willingness to contemplate nuclear war. The result wasn't a complete break, but the relationship became cooler, more cautious, and less trusting. Cuba remained aligned with Moscow, but the personal and political connection between Castro and Khrushchev was never the same after 1962. No. Number three, the crisis led directly to the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963, the first major nuclear arms control agreement, which banned nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in outer space. Number four, Khrushchev's perceived retreat during the negotiations damaged his credibility inside the Soviet Union, contributing to political dissatisfaction that eventually helped lead to his removal from power in 1964. Number five, President John F. Kennedy measured handling of the confrontation, straining his political standing both domestically and internationally, reinforcing his reputation as a steady and capable leader during a global emergency. Number six, the quiet removal of US Jupiter missiles from Turkey and Italy marked a significant shift in NATO's nuclear posture and reshaped how American strategic weapons were deployed in Europe. Number seven, as noted in the American Yawp, the crisis coincided with a renewed wave of Cuban emigration. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans left the island throughout the 1960s, forming the foundation of Cuban American communities, especially in Miami. This migration surge occurred because the crisis confirmed that Castro's dictatorship will remain securely in power forever. After the United States publicly pledged that it would not invade Cuba ever, and the Soviet Union withdrew its missiles in exchange for that promise, many Cubans realized that there was no longer any external pressure that might bring political change or open a path to some sort of freedom, ever. So for the Cuban people, the missile crisis became the final nail in the coffin, because with the Cuban Communist regime now firmly protected and Cuba tied permanently to the Soviet bloc, large numbers of Cubans concluded that the only realistic way to find economic opportunity, political rights, and personal security was to leave the island forever. And that's why so many of us, my family, my friends, my countrymen in general, ultimately found ourselves here and in many other places around this planet. We did not simply migrate, we left because there was no country to return to, no plan B, no path home. The Cuba we lost to communism stayed behind in the past, and the only future available to us was the one we could build elsewhere. And that's all for today, folks. You have been watching Reality Vibes, where facts speak louder than feelings. Take care of yourself. Stay sharp, stay free, and above all, stay real. Thanks for watching, and good night.